It was supposed to be a quiet night in Paris, a brief pause in a whirlwind of romance and relentless media scrutiny. But on August 30th, 1997, just past midnight, the world tipped into shock as a black Mercedes S-80 tore through the city streets and crashed violently in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. Inside was a woman whose name alone stirred headlines and public adoration, Princess Diana. Her death would not only break millions of hearts, but ignite a firestorm of speculation, shadowy rumors, and lingering questions that, decades later, still refused to die. That night, Diana was not alone. She was accompanied by Dodi Fayed, her partner, the son of Egyptian billionaire Mohammed Al Fayed, and their security team. They had spent the day in opulence aboard a yacht along the Riviera before jetting into Paris for what should have been a peaceful overnight stay. Instead, they were forced into a deadly game of cat and mouse with paparazzi, a game Diana had played for years but would lose in the most tragic way. As dust settled over the City of Lights, the couple checked into the Ritz Paris, a hotel owned by Dodi's father. Surveillance footage would later show them smiling, moving through the gilded hallways, unaware that their final hours were ticking away. Knowing they were being tailed, a decoy vehicle was sent from the hotel's front to draw attention. Meanwhile, Diana and Dodi quietly slipped out the back into a black Mercedes driven by Henry Paul, the Ritz's head of security. No one in the car wore a seatbelt. It would prove fatal. Just 3 minutes after leaving the Ritz, Henry Paul lost control of the speeding vehicle while reportedly trying to evade the blinding flashes of pursuing photographers. At approximately 12:23 a.m., the car collided head-on with the 13th pillar inside the Alma underpass. The force of the impact crumpled the front of the vehicle. Eyewitnesses describe smoke, twisted metal, and the eerie silence that followed the chaos. The paparazzi who had chased the car through the streets were now first at the scene, some rushing to capture the moment on film, others, to their credit, trying to help. But Diana was already gravely injured. She was alive, conscious enough to speak faintly, but internally she was hemorrhaging. A passing doctor, Frederick Melias, who happened upon the crash, was the first to offer aid. He described her as dazed, in shock, whispering, "Oh my God," and later, "Leave me alone." The emergency services arrived quickly. Firefighters fought to cut Diana free from the wreckage while police pushed back the onlookers and photographers. 10 minutes after the crash, paramedics began stabilizing her inside the ambulance. A sense of dread grew. Diana went into cardiac arrest en route to the hospital. Her heart was failing. The medical team managed to revive her, buying precious minutes. She arrived at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital at 06 a.m. The doctors were already waiting. Among them was Dr. Monsef Dahman, a young surgeon who suddenly found himself at the center of what would become one of the most scrutinized medical emergencies in modern history. Diana had sustained a massive tear in her pulmonary vein, a nearly always fatal injury. She also had a displaced heart and extensive damage to her chest cavity. Dahman and his team acted quickly, cracking open her chest and performing an emergency thoracotomy to control the internal bleeding. The operating room was tense, filled with urgency and dread. Blood flooded the cavity. They found the heart surrounded by hemorrhage. Her injuries were not only catastrophic, they were complex. Professor Elaine Pavey, a leading cardiothoracic surgeon, was urgently called in. He worked on the pulmonary vein, attempting to suture it and restore circulation. But the bleeding was relentless. Her heart had stopped again. Over the next hour, the team fought a losing battle, applying manual cardiac massage, injecting medications, delivering electrical shocks. Each attempt to revive her was met with silence from the monitors. At 4 a.m., they made the call. Princess Diana was pronounced dead. Outside, the city was quiet, but the rest of the world was beginning to wake up to the devastating news. At 6 a.m., the announcement came: Diana, the Princess of Wales, was gone. Grief swept across continents. Candlelight vigils bloomed outside British embassies. Crowds formed at Kensington Palace, laying mountains of flowers. But as the mourning began, so did the whispers. Why was she in Paris at all? Why didn't anyone wear a seatbelt? Who was Henry Paul? And what was really in his bloodstream that night? And most chillingly, did someone want Diana dead? The questions came hard and fast, and with them, an avalanche of theories that turned tragedy into an international mystery. Almost immediately, the focus turned to Henry Paul, the driver that night. Toxicology reports revealed high levels of alcohol in his system, nearly 3 times the legal limit, along with traces of antidepressants and tranquilizers. This revelation stunned the public. How could the head of security at one of Paris's most prestigious hotels, entrusted with the safety of a royal figure, be allowed behind the wheel in such a state? But the answers only deepened the confusion. Friends and colleagues of Henry Paul insisted he did not appear drunk that night. He was composed, alert, even joking with paparazzi outside the hotel shortly before the crash. Some believed the toxicology results had been manipulated. Others suggested Paul had been coerced or set up. The contradictions became fuel for a fire that would rage for decades. And in the shadows of these theories loomed a far darker suspicion that Diana had been targeted. At the heart of this theory was Mohammed Al-Fayed, father of Dodi. From the very beginning, he refused to accept that the crash was a simple accident. According to Al-Fayed, his son and Diana were murdered, victims of a deliberate plan orchestrated by the British establishment to prevent Diana from marrying a Muslim man. He alleged that Diana was pregnant with Dodi's child, and that this possibility was considered an existential threat to the monarchy. For years, Al-Fayed would pursue these claims in courtrooms, in interviews, in letters to officials. He pointed to everything: the missing CCTV footage from the Ritz, the absence of crash site surveillance, the mysterious Wi-Fi to know that some witnesses saw fleeing the tunnel, never to be traced. He even accused Prince Philip and MI6 of ordering the hit. Too many. It sounded like the ravings of a grieving father, but to others, it made an uncomfortable amount of sense. Diana herself had once written a note, now infamous, saying, "This particular phase in my life is the most dangerous. My husband is planning an accident in my car, brake failure, and serious head injury." The note was dated 1995, 2 years before her death, and it haunted everyone who read it. Was it paranoia or a prophetic cry for help? Diana had often spoken of feeling watched, recorded, followed. Her phone was tapped. Her private life was a public obsession, and her criticisms of the royal family were no secret. Could it really be so far-fetched to imagine that her death wasn't accidental? Meanwhile, behind hospital doors, Dr. Monsef Dahman was reeling. He hadn't spoken publicly about that night for over 2 decades, not out of secrecy, but pain. The trauma of watching a young, vibrant woman slip away despite every effort weighed heavily on him. And yet, as the years passed, the rumors only grew louder. Some accused the hospital of intentionally delaying Diana's treatment. Others alleged that doctors had been ordered to let her die. It was enough to push even the most stoic professionals to the edge. Finally, Dr. Dahman broke his silence. In an interview with the Daily Mail, he described the frantic effort to save Diana's life. The operating room, he said, was filled with tension and fear. Diana arrived in cardiac arrest. Her injuries were horrifying. The tear to her pulmonary vein alone could have killed her within minutes, but they kept trying, knowing the whole world was watching, even if they couldn't see it yet. He explained that in France, the approach was stay and play, stabilize the patient at the scene rather than rushing them to hospital. Some critics pointed to this as a fatal delay. Dahman disagreed. He believed they did everything humanly possible. "We fought for her life with everything we had," he said, voice shaking. "It wasn't enough, but we gave her every chance." And yet the conspiracy theories refused to die. Operation Paget, the official investigation into Diana's death, was launched in 2004 to put these questions to rest. Led by former Scotland Yard Chief Lord John Stevens, the operation interviewed over 300 witnesses and spanned 3 years. They traced the Wi-Fi to know, re-examined CCTV footage, reconstructed the crash, and pored over medical reports. The conclusion: It was a tragic accident caused by a combination of excessive speed, a drunk driver, and the relentless pursuit of paparazzi. No murder, no MI6, no royal orders, but for many, the report raised as many questions as it answered. Why were certain cameras malfunctioning that night? Why did no one inside the car wear a seatbelt, especially Diana, who was known to always buckle up? And why, despite all the resources, did it take so long to transport her to a hospital barely 4 miles away? The silence of those involved only deepened the mystery. The royal family, infamous for their measured and emotionless public persona, said very little. The Queen stayed at Balmoral, shielding Princes William and Harry from the public eye. Her initial lack of response was viewed as cold, even callous, and public anger swelled. It took nearly 5 days for her to address the nation, and even then, her words felt cautious, rehearsed, but behind closed doors, things were far less composed. Prince Charles, tasked with bringing Diana's body home, was reportedly devastated. Witnesses at the hospital described his grief as overwhelming, not the stiff, royal composure, but the heartbreak of a man who had just lost someone he once loved, and the mother of his children. When Charles flew back to London with Diana's casket draped in the royal standard, it marked a shift, a rare moment where duty and personal loss blurred. The funeral on September 6th was watched by over 1 billion people around the world. Streets were packed, mourners sobbing openly. Elton John's rewritten Candle in the Wind echoed through Westminster Abbey. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, delivered a thunderous eulogy, a blistering indictment of the press and a subtle jab at the royal family's treatment of Diana. Applause broke out inside the Abbey, something almost unheard of at royal funerals. It was clear Diana's death wasn't just a private loss, it was a global rupture. And as her coffin was lowered into the ground on her family's estate at Althorpe, a haunting sense of unfinished business remained in the air. The world had lost a princess, but it felt more like losing a sister, a friend, someone who had been there. Not behind palace walls, but in our homes, our headlines, our hearts. She wasn't just royalty, she was human, raw, imperfect, brave, and that's what made Diana beloved. Her vulnerability was her power, and her death felt like a betrayal of that. The woman who had held the hands of AIDS patients when others recoiled, who had walked through active minefields in Angola without flinching, who had redefined what it meant to be royal, was gone. Not in a dignified farewell, but in a blur of flashing lights and twisted metal. It was cruel, and it didn't feel right. Something in the soul of the world shifted that day. There was mourning, yes, but also anger, a kind of grief so sharp it cut through the silence left behind. At Kensington Palace, flowers piled into mountains, so many that the scent of lilies and roses filled the air for blocks. Messages were scribbled on cards by children and elders alike, some just a single word, why? Others were furious. They hounded her to death. One note read, pinned with a teddy bear. Even children sensed it, that Diana had been hunted, not protected, not respected, just followed, photographed, consumed. The public mourning became its own kind of protest, a cry against everything that had failed her. The press, the palace, the cold traditions, the secrets that festered behind Buckingham gates. Inside Balmoral Castle, William and Harry were shielded from the media storm. They were just 15 and 12, boys whose lives had already been fractured by divorce, now shattered by death. Charles broke the news to them, and in that moment, whatever tension had ever existed between him and Diana vanished. All that remained was devastation. He stood as a father, not a prince, trying to explain the inexplicable, and in the quiet Scottish estate, the gravity of the moment took hold. Two boys had lost their mother. A nation had lost its light. But the silence from the monarchy was deafening. No flag lowered over Buckingham Palace. No public appearance, just an aching void. When the Queen finally addressed the nation, her words were calm, deliberate, but they lacked the tremble of grief that the world needed to hear. And so, the people grieved for her too. Not just Diana, but the Queen, seemingly frozen in an old world that couldn't comprehend what Diana had meant to the new one. Behind the scenes, the rumors grew more sinister. Theories twisted into something darker. Not just accidental negligence, but intentional sabotage. What if Diana had known? What if she had felt it coming? That infamous note she wrote in 1995. Could it really have been nothing more than paranoia? Or was it, in her own way, a premonition? A cry for help the world ignored? That note, discovered after her death, described how my husband is planning an accident in my car. The handwriting was hers. The fear unmistakably hers. It sat in a lawyer's file for years. Untouched, dismissed. But now it pulsed with eerie relevance. And it wasn't just that note. Friends said she was increasingly wary. She often spoke of forces conspiring against her. She told close confidants that her phone was tapped, that cars were following her, that she felt like a lamb to the slaughter. We want to believe in logic, that events unfold cleanly, with reason. But what if Diana had every reason to be afraid? What if her fears weren't delusions, but warnings no one took seriously? Dr. Monsef Dahman, the young doctor who fought to save her, carried that night with him for decades. For years, he remained silent, not out of secrecy, but out of sorrow. In his recent interview, he didn't speak like a man trying to defend a position. He spoke like a man haunted. He recalled every second. The sound of the stretcher wheels, the blinding urgency. The way Diana looked when she was wheeled into surgery. Pale, still. Not a princess. A woman on the edge of death. He remembered the torn pulmonary vein, the pericardium flooded with blood, the attempts to revive her heart again and again. But what stays with him most is not the surgery. It's the silence that came after. The moment they stopped. The moment they knew. He didn't just lose a patient. He lost hope. He lost peace because in that room, they weren't just fighting to save a life. They were fighting to stop history from writing itself in blood. And when they failed, they became ghosts in the background of a story that would never be allowed to rest. The accusations would come, and with them guilt. Not guilt from wrongdoing, but from the unbearable weight of having been there and still losing her. In the years that followed, Dr. Monsef tried to return to normalcy. He treated patients, taught young surgeons, carried on as if the night of August 31st hadn't rewired his very soul. But every now and then in a hallway, during an operation, on an anniversary, it came back. That unbearable feeling. That question gnawed at him just as it gnawed at the world. Was she already doomed the moment she entered that tunnel? Not just by fate, but by forces more sinister. The ones with titles and motives and secrets buried beneath marble palaces and red carpets. Because something about Diana's death didn't sit right. Not then, not now. There were too many holes in the narrative, too many things conveniently missing. The white Fiat Uno that allegedly clipped the Mercedes was never found. The CCTV cameras at the Ritz that should have captured the exit route, reportedly malfunctioning. And the driver, Henry Paul. Where had he really been drinking? Some bartenders said they never served him. Others weren't even sure he'd been intoxicated at all. Yet the toxicology results were definitive. Or were they? And how does a head of security end up behind the wheel of a car with two VIPs, when he was supposedly over the legal limit 3 times over? These questions weren't just hypotheticals. They were wounds, and they never healed. Operation Paget tried. Lord Stephen's investigation was exhaustive. 3 years, hundreds of interviews, thousands of pages of reports. It concluded what the official line always had: a tragic accident. High speed, impaired driving, a seatbelt not worn. A perfect storm. But something about that answer only made the silence louder. For every fact, there was a gap. For every statement, a contradiction. Mohammed Al-Fayed wasn't satisfied. He insisted Diana was pregnant, that she and Dodi were engaged, that MI6 orchestrated the crash under royal direction to preserve the purity of the crown. Many dismissed him as a grieving father. But when you looked at the weight of what Diana was becoming, her voice, her independence, her global influence, It wasn't hard to imagine how inconvenient she had become to the institution she once served. Even Charles wasn't spared. From whispers, there were rumors, quiet but persistent, that he knew more than he admitted. That his desire to marry Camilla, once impossible while Diana lived, suddenly became reality not long after her death. Could he really have been involved? Could anyone within the royal family have sanctioned something so unthinkable? These were the kinds of questions people were too afraid to ask aloud, and haunted to ignore, especially after Diana herself seemed to foreshadow her fate. Her friends remembered late-night phone calls filled with paranoia. One described how Diana would call from a landline, whispering about men in gray suits, saying they were closing in. She feared the brakes in her car would be tampered with. She even altered her routes, avoided flying private, and insisted on random changes to her schedule. She was playing defense in a game the public didn't even know was happening. Some saw her as paranoid. Others now see her as a prophet, because in the end, everything she feared came true. The press, so often the villain in her story, didn't escape blame. After all, it was they who chased her car that night, desperate for a photo that would pay thousands. They who snapped pictures as she lay dying in the backseat. They who had stalked her for years outside gyms, restaurants, even her children's school. She once said, "I don't have royal protection. I don't even have peace." It wasn't melodrama. It was her life. The press machine didn't just cover Diana. It consumed her. And in the end, it may have helped kill her. When Earl Spencer spoke at her funeral, his voice trembled with fury. He condemned the media. He condemned the establishment. He spoke not just as her brother, but as her defender. The one voice at that funeral who refused to pretend. And when the audience erupted in applause, it shattered centuries of royal decorum. It was more than just mourning. It was a reckoning. As the applause echoed through the sacred walls of Westminster Abbey, something fundamental cracked, not just in royal tradition, but in public loyalty. For the first time, the people didn't just mourn with the monarchy, they mourned in defiance of it. Diana had become something far larger than her title. She was no longer simply a princess. She was a symbol of compassion, of rebellion, of everything the palace wasn't. And now that symbol lay in a coffin, draped in the royal standard, surrounded by men in uniforms who had never truly known her. In the days after her burial, the silence around her death became louder than the mourning. The unanswered questions turned to obsessions. Why was she allowed to travel without royal protection? Why was the scene of the crash left exposed for so long before being sealed? Why did the ambulance take over 40 minutes to reach the hospital, when in that part of Paris, even with traffic, it should have taken less than 10? And why, according to some witnesses, was Diana still conscious after the crash, speaking and pleading, yet dead just hours later from an injury that only seemed to become fatal inside a hospital? And this is where the conspiracy darkens. Because there are those who believe the true story didn't end in the tunnel, but behind closed hospital doors. That the crash wasn't the fatal blow, but the opportunity, the moment to ensure she didn't survive. Some claimed it was in the ambulance, where Diana inexplicably remained parked for extended minutes before departing. Others pointed to the stay-and-play medical approach, standard in France, yes, but to some, it was the perfect cover. Delay. Wait. Let nature, or something else, take its course. Then came the murmurs about her medical treatment, the claims that standard British royal emergency protocol was ignored, that there were inconsistencies in how her heart was treated, that her internal injuries, while severe, might not have been unsurvivable if addressed faster. The accusations are grim. That someone made sure she didn't leave that hospital alive. That there were instructions, silent, untraceable, but clear. Dr. Monsef Dahman, of course, has denied this vehemently. He says they did everything in their power to save her, that the odds were impossible, that they fought until her final heartbeat. And maybe that's true. Maybe what happened in that operating room was simply a battle lost to time and trauma. But the fact that so many still question it even decades later, speaks to something deeper: a loss of trust, a fear that even in death, Diana was manipulated, silenced, erased. And yet, she endures. In every mural, every whispered conspiracy, every tear shed when her sons, now men, speak her name with reverence and ache. William and Harry have carried her memory like a torch through the darkness of the very institution that seemed to crush her. Harry, in particular, has been unflinching. His interviews, his memoir, his departure from royal life again and again. He's hinted, and sometimes outright stated, that the same forces that destroyed his mother nearly destroyed him. He's spoken of history repeating itself, of paranoia, of rage. In one interview, his words were chillingly simple: "I was terrified of losing another woman I loved." And with that, it became clear: Diana's story didn't die in Paris. It lives on in the bloodlines of those who survived her. But perhaps the most haunting part of Diana's death is not the crash, not the tunnel, not even the theories. It's how easily it could have been prevented: a seatbelt, a different driver, a moment's hesitation, a decision to stay in the hotel, and yet fate, or something else, pushed everything into alignment, like clockwork. And when the clock stopped, it took more than a princess. It took away the one royal who dared to be real, who dared to love the people more than the palace. And now, all these years later, we're left with echoes, not answers. A tunnel in Paris that has become a silent monument. A royal family that has never truly spoken beyond rehearsed statements. And a generation that grew up not just mourning Diana, but asking why she had to die at all. Because Diana wasn't supposed to die in a tunnel at 36. She was supposed to keep changing the world. She was supposed to keep speaking for the voiceless, shaking hands that no other royal dared to touch, and reminding the elite that compassion matters more than tradition. Her death wasn't just tragic. It was unnatural. It felt scripted, like the final act in a play that no one wanted to see end. And maybe that's why so many can't let it go. There's an ache in the collective memory of those who remember her, a kind of unfinished sentence, something that feels unresolved. You see it in the faces of people who leave flowers outside the gates of Kensington Palace every August. You hear it in the voice of Harry when he talks about the flashbulbs blinding his mother. You feel it when the tabloids that once hounded her now chase her sons' wives. The cycle never stopped. It simply found new names. And the questions still haunt the edges of the official story. The mysterious white Fiat, the broken CCTV cameras, the driver with the puzzling toxicology report, the decisions made in the ambulance, the note Diana wrote, her fears, her warnings, the absence of a seatbelt, the paparazzi that vanished from the scene, the lack of formal accountability. They aren't just details, they're shadows. Shadows that stretch long after the headlines faded. Dr. Monsef Dahman did not ask to be part of history. He didn't ask to carry this weight. And yet, when he finally spoke, it wasn't to fan flames or dismiss rumors. It was to tell the truth. As he saw it, a woman brought to him in the middle of the night, bleeding, broken, but alive. And for 60 minutes, he tried to hold that life in his hands. But sometimes, he said, medicine is not enough. Sometimes fate, or something far colder, decides. And what of Prince Charles, now king, a man once engulfed in scandal, now rebranded by time and circumstance? The whispers that followed him never truly died. They just grew quieter, more polite, but in backrooms and online forums. In dinner-table conversations, the theory lives on that Diana's death made his future possible, that her voice was silenced so his could be heard. It's a thought too cruel to believe, and yet too compelling to fully ignore. The monarchy survived. It always does, but at what cost? Diana's death fractured something sacred, a belief that, no matter the secrets behind the palace walls, there was someone inside who truly cared. When she died, that illusion shattered. The golden carriage cracked, and the people, for a brief moment, stopped bowing. In her final moments, Diana wasn't surrounded by family. There were no royal guards, No palace doctors, just a young, off-duty physician. Flashing lights, shouts, sirens, strangers. She died as she lived, exposed, unguarded, and fighting to stay alive, fighting to be heard, fighting to be free. And now, all these years later, her voice is louder than ever, through her children, through her legacy, through the millions who still remember, still grieve, still wonder. Because Princess Diana didn't just die, she disappeared into mystery. And maybe that's the most haunting truth of all. Asterisk.